All right, now what we're going to do is I'm going to bring on our panelists and I'm going to bring on our host, and I want you guys to make everyone feel welcome, and then we'll do the proper introductions once everyone's seated. So, in no particular order, you know what? I'll do from people I can see. Oh, is everyone there? I'm going to do it in the order that people list on the website, which is alphabetical, I believe. You would know him as the man who was delayed getting here. He's a Labor politician, and he's I believe he's sort of he runs all the business in politics. Please welcome Labor member Tony Burke, ladies and gentlemen. We also have a Liberal senator. She's the former Minister for Education, Health and Sport in the Abbott and Turnbull governments. Would you please welcome Senator Sussan Lee, ladies and gentlemen. You have to be polite. Even though you're all young and presumably communists, you need to be very polite. Our next guest is from the Greens, so presumably you all lot are into that. An MP in the New South Wales Parliament and the first Muslim woman elected to an Australian Parliament. Would you please welcome Dr. Mehreen Faruqi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. And now our next guest is the co-founder of SLAM, which is the Save Live Australian Music. Would you please welcome to the stage Helen Marcou, ladies and gentlemen. Got a chant going from these guys for that one. That was pretty good. Now, our fifth panelist, I've not counted this correctly, is from Kaspersky Labs. He knows a lot about hacking. Would you please welcome to the stage Vitaly Kamluk, ladies and gentlemen. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my very great privilege to welcome to the stage the man who presumably you've watched say, I'll take this comment, many times over the last, I'd say, 45 years. Is that how long you've been doing this? Ladies and gentlemen, can I start some applause, please, in the middle? Come on. Start some applause and get some cheers going. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome to the stage host of Q&A, Tony Jones!
Hello, and welcome. You can hear down the back, I dare say, can you? I'll put my glasses on so I can actually see you in real life. Welcome to Splendour Q&A 2017. It's a couple of years since I've done this. I'm really pleased to see a full house. It's just wonderful. I'll tell you more about our panellists in a moment, but if they go well, feel free after a particularly good answer or just at the end of the whole thing to allow them to do some crowd surfing. So we'll need our strongest members of the audience up front when that happens, obviously. I saw that happen overnight, and I just think, you know, it's the sort of rock thing that Tony Burke, guitarist, secret guitarist, might actually like quite a lot. So if you're up for crowd surfing panellists later, we can do that. Now, the weather gods have been pretty good to us this year. They've smiled on us. The sniffer dogs are relatively inconspicuous. None in the tent, anyway, as far as I can see. The crowd is chilled, as you always are. And Kendrick Lamar will soon be beamed down from his Mount Olympus of superstardom, carrying his Pulitzer Prize aloft like a modern Moses or the Black Panther come to life. Here in Splendor's Happy Valley, it seems like all is well with the world. And yet, beyond these green and pleasant hills, the world is being tipped on its axis by another celebrity, a maniacal celebrity, even more famous, with more followers on Twitter than Kendrick Lamar, 53 million of them on Twitter. I'm referring, of course, to the man who overnight on Twitter described himself as your favourite president. Donald Trump went on to say, yes, I'm sure some people have something to say about that. Donald Trump went on to say, and I've done nothing wrong. Your favourite president has done nothing wrong. Well, let's be the judge of that. And I'll let my panellists talk about that later. One dizzying week is all it took to turn the world on its axis. Trump trashed his allies, one after the other, and then he went to Helsinki to cozy up to an enemy of the US state, Vladimir Putin, who used his intelligence services, so it's alleged, to directly interfere in the 2016 US election. In Trump's favour, of course. After the Putin meeting, Trump was widely accused of treachery. Open treachery, screamed one headline. Open treason, I should say, screamed one headline. An awful lot of his own party have been mumbling the treasonous word behind the scenes. To avoid the backlash, on his way home on Air Force One, he simply worked out how to lie about what he'd actually said at the press conference after the Putin meeting. So the bigger the breach, the bigger the lie. Your favourite president flew home and threatened to put up tariffs on all 500 billion of Chinese exports to the US. So some economists are suggesting, warning in fact, that Trump's world order could plunge us into a global recession. So that's all of your jobs, my job most likely, the ABC already under threat, may have no funding at all in a global recession. Even in Splendour, we can see the clouds are gathering beyond these hills. Closer to home, we've got our own brand of toxic politics, ahead of critical by-elections, fierce debates swirling around immigration, around refugees, asylum seekers, competing tax plans, climate change, inequality, sexism, accusations of slavery by the former staffers of a Labor MP from Western Sydney, and the usual spiteful invective that has many voters questioning the value of our political system and the politicians themselves, with all due respect to those on the panel. So, very much to talk about here. Remember that Q&A relies on your questions. Some of you have submitted questions, and I'll call out your names and hopefully you can stand up and ask them. But for the rest of you, simply put up your hand. I'll put my glasses back on and I'll be able to see those with the hands up. Get involved in the discussion if you can. It's always much more fun when you do it rather than me. So there's a hell of a lot to talk about. One more last thought, actually. On recent evidence, our live export trade is still responsible for the kind of medieval savagery towards animals that has some questioning our very humanity. So now to our panellists. Sussan Lee, I'll start with Sussan. Member for Farah. Sussan went against, she's a Liberal, and she went against her own government when she introduced a private members' bill banning live sheep exports. So think about that when you're formulating your questions. Tony Burke, I don't know where Labor Party stands on banning live sheep exports, but you were clapping, so it'll be interesting to find out. Labor Party's chief tactician in Parliament, spokesman for the environment, water, the arts, which is why he took such trouble to be here, I suspect, although without his guitar, citizenship and multiculturalism. Helen Marcou, right down the other end there, is, as those of you who've just jumped in there would know, a legend in the Australian music scene, co-founder and partner of Melbourne's Baker House Studios, co-founder of the grassroots movement SLAM, which is Save Live Australia's Music. Which I assumed, I must say, Helen, should have been Save Australia's Live Music, but that'd be Salem or Salem.
No. Salem, Satan, all of it fits in the rock and roll ethos.
Yeah, of course it does. And she was also instrumental in the formation of the Victorian Sexual Harassment and Assault Task Force for what's happening to women in licensed venues. Doctor, I can see some of the women are calling out, so think about your questions around that subject. Dr. Mehreen, Faruqi was the first Muslim woman elected to any Australian Parliament on August 1. She'll take up the Greens' New South Wales Senate seat vacated by Lee Rhiannon, so she's headed for the Canberra Bear Pit in a few weeks' time. I'm interested to get her reflections on that. And our international guest sitting beside me is Vitaly Kamluk, who works in Moscow as an anti-hacker, developing counter... If you think that's a bit counterintuitive, because there's a lot of hacking been going on in Russia, but Vitaly is not a Russian, he's a Belarusian, and they have a terrific history of anti-hacking. He's been developing countermeasures against malicious software, and he worked for 2 years for Interpol's Digital Crime Centre in cybercrime investigation and prevention. So he actually sounds like the sort of person the US Democratic Party could have used in 2016. Please welcome our panel. Okay, our first question is one that's been sent in to us from Audrey from Melbourne. Where's Audrey? Let's get a microphone to Audrey. There we go. That microphone, by the way, is going to be tossed around to the questioners. It looks like a big rubber box, and it works extremely well. Audrey, if you can stand up to ask your question so we can all see you. Thank you.
I want to ask a question about the behaviour of people in Parliament, like David Leyonhjelm talking about Sarah Hanson-Young and bullying by the Labor politician in Western Sydney. There have been some bad behaviour by politicians recently. How do you find the behaviour of women in the Parliament? And why should any women in this audience want to go into politics in the future?
Okay, Mehreen, I'm going to start with you because you're just about to head into this bear pit, as I've said. You've seen the behaviour towards one of your fellow Green senators, Sarah Hanson-Young, by David Leyonhjelm. How are you feeling going in here?
Thanks, Tony, and thank you very much, Audrey, for that question. Could I say this is my first time at Splendour, and I'm just loving it. I'll definitely come back. Listen, the behavior just recently of David Leyonhjelm, I mean, what do you say? It's been absolutely disgusting, sexist behavior. And it's not the first time that he's done it either. And we've let people like him get away with it for far too long. So, you know, all kudos to Sarah for standing up and calling this out. And we need more and more women to call it out. And I can tell you, you know, that's not the only place where it happens. It happens in many parliaments. The parliament that I sit in New South Wales Upper House, has only 10 women out of 42 members. It's the lowest of any house in Australia. I mean, it's unbelievable that in 2018, that is the situation in Australia.
You shouldn't be walking away from those other 9 women. Where's your solidarity?
Well, there will be another woman who will be taking my place. So that's where the solidarity is. The Greens did make sure that if a woman is vacating that seat, that another woman should be able to take that seat. And I think that's the difference between the Greens and some other parties. But David Leyonhjelm was, you know how he came into Parliament? I don't know if many of you remember, but he got a lot of the donkey vote in 2013. That's how he got into Parliament. We've got to boot him out. And you know, in New South Wales, at the next Senate election, it'll be a race between David Leyonhjelm and me. So it's a pretty clear-cut choice for a lot of people. But what I want to say is, it's, you know, these people who speak like that, and David Leyonhjelm had called other women, or at least one woman, a bitch. And what he said to Sarah Hanson-Young is kind of an indicator also of what goes on in society too. Because it's not just happening in Parliament, it's happening across society. And it is a huge problem, sexual violence, sexual assault, harassment, intimidation, and we've got to look at it in a bigger picture way. And it's up to all of you at the end of the day to make these politicians accountable. So when you go to the ballot box, you need to think about that. And in between the ballot box, we need to call out bad behavior every single time it happens. I'm relishing the opportunity to go into the Senate and also call that behavior out. Not just David Leyonhjelm, but I'm relishing in the opportunity to come face to face with One Nation's Pauline Hanson. And hopefully saying Assalamu alaikum to her the first time I see her.
She'll say what she said to, on the Q&A program. Are you a Muslim? Are you really a Muslim? You seem much nicer than that.
Oh, I'll have a good response for her, not to worry, Tony.
Helen, as Mehreen just said, it goes a hell of a lot wider than politics. I'll come to our politicians in a minute, but give us your reflections on what you've seen in Australian politics and how and what message is being sent to the rest of the country.
What I'm really disappointed in, and everyone's expecting the women in Parliament and women to speak out about this, for the men and the colleagues in the Australian Parliament, what you walk past, you promote. So these sort of backroom slanderous comments are unacceptable, and I believe that they need to lead. They absolutely, and we're lacking leadership when the men in Parliament don't call him out. The other thing as well is him quoting back to Sarah Hanson-Young, the whole not all men, well, yes, not all men are violent, but all men have benefited from the subjugation of women for the eternal history of our time. So I think it's really important that we come together in society, we call this out, our male allies and women together.
Let's go to Tony Burke. Have you benefited? Tony, have you benefited from the subjugation of women?
Oh, I think any male who doesn't think that they've benefited from inequality in Australia is kidding themselves. absolutely kidding themselves. Of course we have. And of course we've got a responsibility to be part of the solution in fixing that. Labor now, we're at 48% women in the federal parliament. The comments which is short of what it needs to be. We would not have got there without quotas though. We would not have got there without quotas, but we're at 48% now, and we'll either be at 50 or beyond 50 after the next election. The thing with David Leyonhjelm is twofold. One, what he said, absolutely horrific and unacceptable. No halfway explanation or anything like that. But the other thing we have to know is this. Once the condemnation of him happened, he loved it. He went and did every possible interview and promoted himself off the back of it as much as he could, because there is still a significant section of society that loves it, that loves that sort of hateful language towards women. And that's where, to be able to fix this, it has to be done inside the parliament and outside the parliament, because he rode that wave really, really hard and loved every minute of it. The other thing with respect, though, we have to look at all the sorts of advantage, because let's face it, being male's not the only one in this country that I've benefited from. And you know, I live in a part of Sydney where 75% of people speak a language other than English at home. I live in a suburb called Punchbowl that some of you would know. Yeah. Oh, good. Every time we hear a calling out of crime which is race-based or ethnic-based, I think here we go again. It
Tony,
is no better than
I'm going to pause
Leyonhjelm.
you on that subject, because we are going to come to that in more detail. But let me just pick up on, there was another part of that question, and it was about misbehaviour, alleged misbehaviour by a Labor MP, one of your own in Western Sydney, Emma Hussar, accused of treating her staff, and particularly her male staff, as slaves. And the accusation here is she was trying to teach them about white male privilege. So it does kind of resonate a little bit with this discussion. How true is it?
Well, the explanation how true is it, I don't know. Emma is a great member of Parliament, a single mum who has been a passionate advocate against family violence and in favour of people with disabilities. She has only been there a short time and has made an extraordinary impact on the federal parliament. The particular reference you gave was the way it reads, a joke that was made when a male member of staff was told it was his turn to do the dishes. Now, you know...
Well, actually, the accusation is everyone had to take a turn at being her slave. And now, I don't know whether this is true. Allegedly, it's the Australian, so you have to say allegedly. Yeah. But allegedly, according to the Australian, subject to fact-checking, and that's part of what we're doing here, she was doing this to a number of people, and it's being investigated by the Labor Party. True or not true?
Oh, true that it's being investigated, as it should be. That investigation will happen independently, and that'll turn out how it does. The thing that I can tell you is what I know about Emma, which I've done.
Okay, thank you very much. Sussan Lee.
Thank you, Tony. And can I congratulate the Splendour organisers? My daughters have been coming here for years, and now I finally get to find out what it's all about, and I love it. I don't make judgments about my fellow politicians unless I make them from personal experience. I never judge someone by what I read in the media. Having said that, I've had a few dealings with David Leyonhjelm, and I find him a singularly unimpressive individual. The other thing is, he really doesn't like my stand on live sheep exports, and he's going to run a candidate against me in my seat of Farah, and I say, bring it on. But when we look at how women are treated in the parliament and how we may or may not be insulted, I think I would just like to place a layer of moderation above that, because where we are, we're very lucky. Our lives are lucky to have even arrived in the federal parliament or even a state parliament. There are women who work in domestic lines of work, who work in factories, who work as shop assistants, who are effectively powerless about the men around them and the things that they do. And I always say that as women in parliament, we have to think of those women first.
Okay, let me bring in Vitaly. It's pretty tough for an international guest to be asked to comment on Australian politics. So you look at it from your own perspective. Are the same problems evident in Russian society, in Belarusian society as well, since you're from Minsk, but also in the parliaments of both of those countries?
Well, from my perspective, actually, it's my first time as Splendour as well. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So from my perspective, we don't see exactly the same thing you mentioned. What I can see is that there are definitely lack of women in the parliament, in the parties, in Russia and in Belarus, where I'm from. I can also speak for the industry where I'm from, and I'm from information security industry, where we experience like a disastrous lack of females in this sector. And I don't know. I really want to encourage all the young ladies here to try them in their skills in the information security, because I can't imagine a better future for all of us other than this beautiful part of population of humanity joining us and cracking some of the hardest problems in the world. So
you're going to have to do a lot to change the well-known misogynistic kind of tendency of the tech world. I mean, it's one of the extraordinary things about Silicon Valley is how few women there are.
That's right. I think we need more women in the industry. So please think about this as well. Not only political career, but there are other places to take. We are waiting for you there.
Let's move on. Unless does anyone have a question they want to? Yes, got a hand up there. We'll throw the little thing to you if we can keep going on this subject. Over here, keep your hand up.
Hi. Look, I have to be very honest and say that I totally adore Tony and I totally adore Sussan. Sorry, Dr. Faruqi, I don't know you well enough to be able to make a comment. My biggest concern is that in this modern environment where we have the 5-minute political sector, that we're really running a campaign of this election, only this election. There's no long-term planning. There's no congeniality between parties. And I can remember as a teenager growing up, I remember every member of the government and the opposition, because they stayed in their positions long enough to actually form an opinion. We also saw, sorry, dating myself a little bit here, but in the Hawke, Keating and perhaps maybe the Fraser era, we actually saw an environment where we saw long-term planning. My concern and my question to you is, do you think we'll ever get back to a point where we can put partisan politics behind and actually start making some government for this country rather than actually making some electoral cycle politics?
Brilliant question, and I think it actually reflects, thank you. I hear from our politicians on that. It reflects the feedback we constantly get on the actual Q&A program from very broad audience feedback I'm talking about. A kind of feeling that politicians really only look over to the next election. The long-term planning is a thing of the past. I'll start with Sussan. Why do you think there's this distrust, and what it is about your government that person is not seeing as being long-term?
I understand people's dislike, mistrust, frustration with politicians because we hear about it all the time for politicians as a particular class. But when people talk about their politician, their local member, they're often quite complimentary because they've had an experience with that individual that has nothing to do with the political debate and everything to do with the personal intervention, which is what we all do day to day, as well as that big picture stuff.
So what do you think? People are being put off by the leaders? Is that what you say?
I don't necessarily think so. I think they're being put off by the 24-hour media cycle. I think they're being put off by the comments that we make in response to that cycle, some of which I'm sure if I look back over my career in politics, I will wish I hadn't made. But it's just so iterative. You know, one thing happens, then another, then there needs to be a response, and so on and so on. And because your Twitter feed and your news cycle goes 24/7, it doesn't matter if you wake up at 3 in.the morning, you find yourself picking up your phone and seeing what's going on, which is not necessarily a good thing. So if we go back to those Howard, Keating, Costello, Hawke days, the pace was actually slower. But I do want to reassure everyone that in the background, our departments who operate independently of politics and under our Westminster system actually do that very well. They actually keep the show running.
Yeah, but they only do what the politicians tell them to do in terms of policy. So
Up to a point, but
I'll go to Tony Burke and just answer from your perspective, will you? Because it's a plague on both their houses as we see it. Really talking about the two major parties, but others as well.
Two things. One, part of what you've described, I think, in fairness, we've had 6 changes of Prime Minister in 8 years, and that's part of it. Obviously, I want there to be one more change, but in that pace, that does mean that ministers keep changing jobs, and you don't have that same length that really helps. The other thing is, there is in fact long-term planning in different ways. I think the best example of long-term planning that's survived all the different Prime Ministers at the moment is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, for a whole lot of people, that is transformative in their lives, and it's only been possible because we had an issue that rose above the party politics, and both sides agreed, okay, they were going to implement it. On education reform, we did have a 10-year plan, but there was a change of government, and so that model changed. The government at the moment has a 10-year plan on company tax cuts, which we oppose, but in terms of, is it a 10-year plan? Yeah, it is. So I think some long-term planning is there, but I think there's two things that have happened. One, we've had lots of changes of PM. The other thing is, I think there's a reluctance now for any Member of Parliament to specialise. I mean, I'm really lucky now in that I'm responsible for all the things I love that were the reason I got involved in politics in the first place.
Specialising in 6 different portfolios.
Yeah, and you look at them, they're all technically junior portfolios in different departments, all of them. But I joined the Labor Party over the back of the Daintree Rainforest campaign. So the environmental issues, I've always been passionate about. The involvement with the arts and the way you can affect the national mood is something that I kept wanting, except I had the grave misfortune of arriving in Parliament at the same time as Peter Garrett. So I thought, I'm never going to get either of those. And then eventually I did. And I've tried to keep them as much as I can. But I think to really get to know us, we need to stay in the same place for long enough. And there hasn't been a lot of that.
I'll go to Mehreen to hear your view, and then we'll move on to other subjects, actually, because we've got quite a few questions to get through. Go ahead.
There is good reason, I think, that people are so totally disengaged from politics. We talk about that so much. And that's the reason why people like Trump, people like One Nation, people like David Lynham have been able to come into politics. Because, you've heard the phrase, let Trump be Trump, is touted often enough. And it's because whether you like it or not, people see him as someone who speaks their mind. And I think that's the problem that we're in at the moment. We repeat these, lines that we've rehearsed in focus groups or with media advisors or whatever, and we don't really come across as people who are genuinely interested in what the community wants. But I think more than that, we have seen the influence of the big end of town for many, many years in politics. The fossil fuel industry, which is actually stunting our move to renewable energy. The influence in New South Wales of big agribusinesses, which resulted in land clearing laws that will decimate our forests and our natural places and our trees. So there is very good reason why we are not planning for the long term, because we're not listening to what the communities want. And you cannot deny that over the last decade, inequality has been rising. Climate catastrophe is upon us and we're doing nothing. Education, young people are being screwed over again and again. So of course there's been no long-term planning. And my 5 years experience in New South Wales Parliament, my 5 years in New South Wales Parliament, my experience has been that politicians, many of them, it has become a career. Politics did not used to be a career, it used to be a public service. So we are interested in getting re-elected more than interested in doing the right thing for the community, for the people and what they're saying, and that's what needs to change. And I think, again, political parties, of course, need to re-look at what they do. Otherwise, this cycle of disengagement, disempowerment from the community will continue, and it does not benefit any of us, inside politics or outside politics.
Okay, I see a hand up there. Is that the person who asked the question? Stand up again.
Sorry, I'll just come back to
yeah, you can. I will give you a chance to get back in. Yeah, sure.
Okay, one last comment. The Snowy hydroelectric scheme that occurred in the 1950s would not have happened without bipartisanship. Gonski, as a teacher, was a really great model that died in its arse because of the fact that we had bipartisanship occurring. And now you can look at anything else. NDIS, okay, there's some benefits, there's a lot of traction there, but there's also things like the NBN. And I'd just say that maybe I'm on my own, maybe I'm with other people, but I would like to see government as opposed to politics. And I get what you're saying, Dr. Faruq, but I really do believe that we have now gone to the point where we are looking at individual cases as opposed to government for the nation. We're looking at individual personalities, and certainly I followed both Sussan Ley and Tony Burke's careers. I think they're fantastic people, but I'd like to see more of their ilk in
good.
this
We've got
government.
that point. We'll take that as a comment. There's a hand jumped up down here. So this is great that you throw this thing around. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, this is actually a cybersecurity question since you're here. And so one of the things that we're trying to do at the moment is trying to centralize...
You need to speak up to something.
Hi there. My name's Kevin, I'm from Sydney. It's a cybersecurity question. One of the things that we're trying to implement right now is centralized medical records. It's called My Government, My Health. Is it My Health Record? Yes, MHR.
Yeah, My Health Record is a digitised... Well, it's your health records being digitised, and there are questions about the security of the process. Go ahead.
Yes. So we had a similar scheme over in the UK, which kind of failed. But one of the things I really want to know is that a lot of medical practitioners see the benefits in digitising it. It's much more efficient. But there's also the very, very obvious security flaws. It's honeypots, plus you can't account for the GP's own security plans as well. So I was wondering, is there such a system where you can actually create a centralized database which works for the government and works for the community, but also have it safe as well? Have you seen anything like that?
Okay, yeah, Vitaly, you're across the My Health Record story, are you?
Am I across?
You understand what he's asking?
Yeah.
Go.
Well, of course, my answer is there were attempts. Short answer, yeah. In details, I just want to remind that just 2 days ago here at Splendour, together with my co-speakers and another table, in this tent, we were warning about the risks of putting everything into one single database. We were talking about risks for the My Health data, My Health record, how's it called, right? Just yesterday, the news came out that Singapore had similar model. It was maintained by SingHealth, Ministry of Health of Singapore, and this database was compromised. 1.5 million people, personal records, including PII, got leaked, including the address and names and the ID numbers and so on, including also the Prime Minister's own medical prescriptions. And 160,000 of other medical prescriptions of patients got leaked as well. So it just, this case tells by itself that I don't think that Singaporeans didn't put any effort to secure that database. They definitely did.
The fear is, obviously, that if any one of you had a health problem, for example, if you had a period of mental illness and you didn't want, you're better now, you're not on medication, but some employer may be able to buy your health data and work out whether or not, in the past, you might be a risk as far as they're concerned. That's the kind of fear we're talking about.
Yeah, some of youngsters definitely do not understand the risks of this privacy violation. The risk there is for your future jobs. Even if it's not your own record, but maybe record of your relatives, your dad, your grandfather, that tells that you have, certain disease in the family, and then you will be banned from taking certain job. Or imagine how it can be used by insurance companies. They can look into that and definitely change, accordingly. So these are the risks that you can feel. But there is also an infinite number of possibilities how this information can be used by scammers. And I see that every day. Like, information about people put on Facebook is used by scammers to actually steal money, to gain money. From people who believe them, because it is so true what they're telling about you, and they are engaging you into conversation, and then finally you lose money somewhere.
Okay, I'll throw it to the politician. Sussan, what do you think about this? I mean, you were there when this whole process began. the digitisation of personal health records is seen as a huge revolution in health in Australia, as it was in other countries, a way of saving money, a way of aggregating health data so that research can happen into illness, etc., etc., etc. But are the risks too high? Vitaly's telling us what happened in Singapore. In Britain, something similar happened. It turned out the NHS was actually selling the data to drug companies, which is pretty amazing.
Well, we're not Singapore and we're not Britain, Tony, and I do want to just give a brief example of how having a digital health record could assist you. We operate a state-based health system, so if you arrive in the emergency department of a hospital that is not your home state and you are unable to speak or explain what your medical condition is, it might be an anaphylactic reaction, for example, the digital health record has a break glass function on your Medicare card that actually gives the emergency doctor the access to your records that could save your life. That's an individual example. If there are issues around scamming and privacy, as Vitaly has described, then they should be fixed. I'm certainly not saying that there are. The other thing is...
Sussan, is the problem, see, in Singapore and in Britain too, these things got fixed after the data breaches, because people didn't realise that their security wasn't strong enough.
Well, there aren't data breaches in Australia, but what there is an opportunity for you as an individual to go into your own health record. So it's not being kept by some amorphous organisation in the sky or the cloud. You have access to it. You can go in and you can suppress the information in it that you do not want to be revealed to your insurance company, to your employer, something about your sexual health, your prescriptions, your mental health, and so on. Now, obviously, we have to get that right. I'm not saying that there may not be opportunities to intercept that data, but I've yet to actually hear of a genuine case.
Vitaly
But I think the argument is that...
Vitaly just wants to jump in. I'll let him respond to what you've said and come back to you.
Just a few words from my perspective. As I understand, if I understand correctly, the current model of the My Health record is opting out if you don't want this. I think this is the wrong model. So those people who think this will be useful to them, they should apply, and it should be opt-in model.
Well, there is some history around that. Under the previous government, it actually was an opt-in model, but nobody was opting in. And I think that if people hear misinformation about it, but remember, it's about your health. It's not about the opportunity for scammers to get private information from you. It's about the efficiency for you and your health. If you go to a different doctor and you have to provide all those scans and all that information, go through all those hoops and use up all that taxpayers' money in Medicare, getting all the treatments done again when they simply are with your previous treating doctor. And we've all had that experience. It is about efficiency of the health system. It is also about saving life. I genuinely believe that.
Okay, let's see if there's a bipartisan consensus on the My Health record. Tony?
Both things are true in that the importance of being able to make sure that we don't end up with data breaches is absolutely critical. We also can't deny the fact that when you aggregate all of this data, there will be health outcomes that save lives, that improve health. There'll be links between symptoms in one area and other diseases that had not previously been worked out. When you aggregate that sort of data in a country which has a Medicare system, there will be changes in people's lives that are fundamentally good. But the responsibility, and I'm not in government, I'm not able to answer whether they've got the adequate work to avoid the data breaches. The responsibility on the government is to avoid data breaches from occurring and for people to be very much aware if they want to opt out, they can. But it is true what Sussan just said about the big differences in health outcomes that can be delivered when you collate that sort of information.
Yeah, I'll just go to Mehreen. Earlier you were talking about governments not planning ahead. This is actually an example of governments planning ahead. There may be serious flaws in the planning, but we don't know quite yet. Vitaly is pointing out to them. What do you think?
Well, we may not be UK and we may not be Singapore, but we have had our problems in this space. Just last year, Medicare records turned up on the internet. I think we all remember that. We have the census, the big crash during the census. And, you know, we've had laws, which have actually taken away privacy from people. You might remember the data retention laws, mass surveillance laws, where the government can actually look into records of any single one of us without a warrant. That's pretty much like criminalizing everyone. So we do have privacy issues. Of course, technology like this is always useful, and we need to plan ahead. And it can be useful for how doctors treat us and for patients. But we need to have a bit more of a debate about this. It shouldn't be done in Parliament and shouldn't be done quickly. You know, the Greens did propose some years ago, and I think it was when Scott Ludlam was here, and we're still pushing for that, for an independent digital rights commissioner who works with the Human Rights Commissioner. Because this is about human rights. This is about individual privacy. Like, digital privacy is no different from privacy at home. We have to look at it in exactly the same way. So let's have an open conversation. So whatever we plan for the future and whatever we plan for the long term does not erode our rights as citizens.
Okay, Helen wants to be part of the debate. Go ahead.
I want to talk about my right as a citizen as well. I think it's so important for there to be rigour around a rollout of something that has such sensitive data. So if we're giving up our medical health records, now the architect of the My Health Plan is the same person that did the UK one. Now, people's personal health records were sold on to pharmaceutical companies. And this has to be ironed out before it's rolled out. It is important to have centralised data if we can save lives and help people. But again, rigour and careful protection of our data needs to be not only debated, but it needs to be ironed out.
Okay, and I'll bring Vitaly back in. Is it possible to protect such records in a central database? Because if you're saying it isn't, then your job obviously is to try and make sure that it is. Can people like you protect our data?
There are, of course, technologies that can help us here, but we are humans who handle the technologies, and this is where all the flows come from. What I can say is that if the government decided really plans to put up such a database, have they thought about the scenario if this database got hacked and got leaked? Do they have an action plan? Because from my perspective, there is no if it will be hacked. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah. Okay, Sussan, I'll give you a final word on this. You had, as I said, you had a role in this. So is there an action plan for if there is a hack?
Yes, there is, in short. These are new and in many cases emerging technologies. We shouldn't retreat at the first sign of a problem. We should recognise the health benefits and the efficiency of our health system. Because whether you're in Tony's party, my party, or soon to be Mehreen's party, you will understand the importance of budgets, and there's only a limited amount of dollars to do the job. So let's not waste them having repeated tests, repeated scans, repeated medical procedures when all of the information could be sitting there in a long-term record that, after all, is about you and your health and making it the best.
Okay, the people throwing up their hands, which is a very good thing, so I want to encourage that. Well, quickly, there's a hand in the middle here. Go to that gentleman. Then we'll bring it down to the front if we can. Go ahead.
Hi, just to what Sussan Lee mentioned about removing information from your
My
My Health
trouble
record.
hearing you up here.
Okay, Sussan Lee mentioned you can remove information from the My Health record, but the health department has indicated that you can make it private, but that information will remain there, so that if there is a data breach, that information will be made available to whoever's. So you have no actual control on what is and isn't there, and once it's there forever, as far as the health department has suggested. What do we have with regards to that?
Okay, Sussan, once again, you're probably the biggest expert on the panel on this.
That information may still be necessary if your emergency treating physician needs it. You may not want your insurer to know it, you may not want your employer to know it, but if you're on certain types of medication that interfere with other types of medication and you're in the emergency area of a hospital, you actually want your doctor to know everything. So that's the reason for that. But I'm not apologising for data breaches. I'm saying we have to get that right. We do have to get that right, and we have to be responsive to the community's concerns when we don't. We have to take it really, really seriously.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? Is it the case that, given that all of these records are held in your individual doctor's office, usually on a pretty unsecured computer. Is it the case that actually sophisticated hackers probably find it a hell of a lot easier to get into your private health records in your private doctor's surgery?
Well, they can do that now, Tony, because my doctor's records, if I don't have any health record, are exactly where you said they are. So let's differentiate between what we have now, which is information stored on servers about all of us, or stored by Google or Facebook, let's acknowledge that, and information that's in a digital health record. So there are layers of different security. If we get the digital health record right, we are doing a good thing for the country and the community.
Okay, let's move on to another subject. Keep your hands ready, guys. We'll come to you in a minute. I just want to go to a different subject because we had some questions sent in. As I said, we have one from Eliza in Canberra. Where's Eliza? Here we go.
Hello. There's been conflict between residents wanting sleep and live music fans wanting music. It's sad because a lot of residents actually move to lively areas just to enjoy live music culture. Should government be making music venues fully sound insulate their venues, or should property developers have to soundproof new housing, or both?
Yep. Should venues or housing near venues be soundproof? Okay, well, obviously we're going to go to Helen for that one. Live Music Australia, go ahead.
Okay, so when we're talking about residential encroachment and gentrification and the changing of our urban landscape, a good night's sleep is really important, but also the ability to practice and participate in our culture. And government does play a role, a really important role, because when we're laying out these cities and managing the expectations of these new residents, what do we want? Do we want corporate dormitories in the inner city, or do we want a place where we can go and be together and experience live music, art, culture? Now, in Victoria recently, we introduced Planning Principle 5243, which is the Agent of Change principle. It's world precedent, world policy, planning legislation, and it means that if you move next door to a live music venue and or you're a developer and you're putting up a development, the onus is on the developer to attenuate properly, no longer on the venue. And it works both ways as well. It's actually really clever, and it works both ways. So if you're
Helen, do you have any sympathy at all for people who move into a neighbourhood where there's a venue that's been playing live music loudly for decades, and they suddenly form a little group and decide this can no longer continue because we're living here now?
There is a buyer beware thing. People should do their due diligence when they move into a cultural activity area, cultural cluster, nighttime activity. They should know this. But then there's the real estate, the big pitch. Come here, it's the weasel word, vibrant. I hate that word. So vibrancy is something that politicians love to use, and so do councillors, and so do real estate agents. But the reality is that sometimes you will be woken by live music, patron noise, etc. And so there are ways to get around that. So they're good urban design, attenuation, managing crowds, etc.
And sometimes you'll do a Q&A in a live music venue, actually, and we're hearing the music from outside, but it's not impairing the discussion at all, I'm pleased to see. Now, Tony Burke, let's hear from you on this. Obviously, as the Shadow Minister for the Arts, or Shadow Spokesperson for the Arts, this is going to be a big issue. It's one of those issues that impacts on everyone in this room for sure. But in every major city that I know of, people are seeing their live music venues close down one after the other. Is there anything you can do about it?
Well, this is why when I was Arts Minister a few years ago now, we established the Office of Live Music, because I was sick to death of seeing this game play out. I mean, no one moves to the beach and then complains about the noise of the surf. No one moves to a main road and says, oh no, there's traffic, and if you move near a live venue, there'll be music. And when people leave the venue after they've had a really great night, they're probably not going to be that quiet, and that's where you've moved. I don't want to see a situation where we continue to see venue after venue shut down. New South Wales Parliament, you may well have been involved in the inquiry, recently held an inquiry about this exact issue. Isabella Manfredi from the Preachers appeared and went through a list of 15 to 20 venues that she had played on, only 2 of them were still open in Sydney. This can't go on, and residents have to know you move into an area with music, there'll be noise. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. Okay, but that was a wonderful sort of Jeremiah. But what can you do about it?
It goes to every layer of government. It goes to every... Local government needs to play its part. State government needs to play its part. Federally, we funded the Office of Live Music. The current government has defunded the Office of Live Music. But what you have to do is have every layer of government taking full responsibility instead of everybody claiming it's someone else's fault. All 3 have to play a role. Any one of the 3 can wreck it.
Okay, Mehreen. Used to work in the parliament that brought in lockout laws.
Well, I was about to mention that.
Go ahead.
Because what's really killed the live industry scene in New South Wales is those dreaded lockout laws. And the Greens were really the only party who opposed them, tooth and nail. Because we've seen venues close down. I don't think it's had much of an impact on reducing violence, because violence has just moved out from those areas to other areas. So there are much better ways of looking at how to address that violence. And you all know that, if you look at the map, we were talking about this earlier, if you look at the map of where lockout laws are imposed, there's a little bit in the middle where there are no lockout laws. There are no prizes for guessing what it is, but could anyone tell us? Exactly right. So it was done, it had a completely different agenda. So the inquiry is a good thing in New South Wales Parliament. I think its intentions are good, but we really have to reverse those lockout laws.
Mehreen, do you think there should be lockout laws for casinos, just by the way?
I think we should have a consistent approach, Tony. That's what I think.
Okay.
Okay, so lockout laws.
I'm very interested to hear your perspective on this, Helen, because the flip side of this is violence within venues. That's the flip side of the lockout laws, and it's one of the things that your task force is looking at. Tell us about it, why you've formed it.
The sexual assault task force.
Yeah, exactly.
Moving to that.
Yeah, because the lockout laws were brought in New South Wales, stop violence in the streets. But you're talking about sexual harassment and violence, sexual violence within venues.
Well, I had championed live music venues for 6 or 7 years as places that mitigate violence, but there was this underlying violence. And the stories of musicians were coming to me of being intimidated, harassed, even assaulted within their own workplace. Now, artists aren't afforded the same workplace harassment protections because they're micro businesses. And it's very difficult for them to, when they're in that environment. So the Sexual Assault and Harassment Task Force was formed through Jane Garrett down in Victoria. We called for policy, and I used my position on the table of privilege to be no longer a yapping activist biting Tony Burke's heels from a few years ago, to call for this policy. Now, we've created a policy around prevention. There's training.
Is that prevention, by the way, you mentioned artists, you didn't mention audience members?
Well, it's everyone. Look, really, a lot of the research was based on Dr. Bianca Philiburn's 400 case studies that she had. She's a criminologist from New South Wales, and a lot of patrons feel that the security guards' roles was often to protect the venue and not the patrons. So if we're really going to look at safe spaces, a dignified night out, safe festival spaces, it has to come through education, whether it's training policy for security staff, hospitality staff, managers, a public awareness program. So it's a multi-pronged approach. But when we're talking about violence, I just want to raise something.
Yeah.
The stats in Sydney, the violence has risen in the lockout areas. Lockout laws do not work. We need nuanced laws and nuanced policy where we have people being able to attend arts and cultural events especially, and being able to exit at different times of the night.
Let's just see, among the women in the audience, anyone who's been harassed? Okay, there's a hand up. Do you want to tell us about that? Is that possible? Get a microphone to you quickly. Yep.
Hello, I'm from Sydney, and I recently went to a gig.
Could you put a bit closer to your mouth, sorry.
I recently went to a gig where one of the security guards accosted me. he pushed me, and I made a complaint to the manager, and they were very helpful. But I found it really shocking that I wasn't respected at this venue by the person that I thought would be, helpful to me. Obviously, I think at a lot of other venues, I have had friends who have personally said men have approached them, they have been made to feel uncomfortable, but I don't know where, that's my experience, but
Sure.
I don't think it's anything new.
Okay, we've got another hand up over there. We'll just toss the microphone device in that direction. Good catch, well done. I think.
Hi, I am an artist, I'm a DJ, and I'm often playing in Sydney until 3 a.m. or later, and I find actually the most dangerous thing is that there isn't consistent or widespread public transport available. So as a woman, I need to wait for 45 minutes by myself at a bus stop.
Yeah.
Considering Eurodistricts and considering all of the danger that women face every day, I've been locked out of a venue at 2 a.m. and I've had no way to get home without spending a $70 Uber or walking for 40 minutes to a bus stop.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if there's any action plans beyond just ending lockouts, but also making our city safer for women and everyone really, by providing better public transport options and better options in and out of our city.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. I'll start with Helen again. Eurydice Dixon had everybody thinking about this issue. Here's a comedian returning home, gets assaulted, raped, murdered, and then the police turn around and say, well, women just shouldn't be out on the streets at that time of night. But what choice do they have?
We're told to stay home. We're told not to go out. The biggest violence is really happening in the home. It's domestic violence. This is where we've seen a spike in violence against women. But when we're talking about leaving venues and venue safety, it's an all-of-government approach, as we talked about. It's also an all-of-society approach. So it begins in education, back in primary school, about the way we talk about each other and address each other, all the way to the venue. But someone mention security guards, for example. If we're talking around education, there are 75,000 ticketed security guards in Victoria. It's a 4 or 5 day TAFE course. So each individual venue also has a responsibility, and really most of them are good citizens. They want to mitigate violence in their environment, but they need the training and the education and the tools to do it. And I believe the more we talk about it and the public talk about it, we will see change begin. But that is such a small percentage of what happens, but that's the fear that we live with as women. And together as a community, we need to support every woman.
Okay, we've got a few other women throwing their hands up, which is a great thing. We'll come right down the front here, as I promised earlier, and then to the right, there's a young woman with her hand up as well. We'll go back to that. Go ahead. Stand up if you wouldn't mind.
Is it on? Hello. Just going back on that, and sort of the current models of positive relationships that we're seeing by politicians. Current neurological evidence suggests that children establish many of their morals and values between the ages of 5 and 12. Due to the education that they receive both in the home and at school. Given the recent outcry and what we've just heard about Eurydice Dixon and starting at education, why aren't models of respectful relationships and the values of gender equality being taught to children within the Australian curriculum just as strongly as we fund maths and science in the curriculum? It is all very well and good to fund the STEM streams for aspiring young female scientists, but this is a redundant act if these women are later killed or beaten of all their self-worth.
Very good question. Sussan, I'll start with you and I'll hear from Tony as well.
Well, thank you for your question, because you are raising an incredibly important issue. And a long time ago, I was the early childhood minister, and what I learnt was that you build models of resilience in children between the ages of 0 and 4. So when I visited early childhood centres, I was most interested in the sort of education they were giving those little guys. And I'm very pleased to say that in that area, it's very strong, and a lot of time is spent on building resilience, personal resilience, which is important because Unfortunately, if you abuse another person, it often comes from a place of personal anxiety or personal disrespect or personal confusion. So you have to be happy within yourself to be a contributing positive member, whether it be at our age, your age, or a very small child. So I do think there is a balance between the classic curriculum modules and those sort of teachings about respectful relationships. But I also think it's a tough call on teachers to try and instruct students, even aged 8 and above, in something that they either haven't learnt already or aren't getting at home.
Sussan, it might require specially trained teachers, which would require money from a government to allow them to do that. Now, there's no reason why the federal government couldn't issue a grant to allow that to happen, as with the grants they've made, your government has made, to allow religious teaching within schools. So would it be more valuable to put that money to some program to teach respectful relationships?
Well, the chaplaincy program doesn't actually have to have a religious basis in schools, but it does have to have a personal reaching out to students, so it doesn't need to be religious instruction. That's a misunderstanding about that program.
Just a quick question though, why does it have to have a fund?
It does have a fund, and it's well supported by schools. So it isn't the government saying, everyone, this is what we want you to do, follow our instructions. I can't tell you the number of actual schools in my electorate that wrote to me saying we want to keep the program. And then I met some of those chaplains, and religion doesn't come into their day-to-day work at all. Because can you imagine how unsuccessful they would be if it did?
Chaplains are already being paid, right? I mean, they're getting money for doing what they're doing in the schools, and you're giving them more money.
I would like to think that what this young lady has raised is embedded in the ethos of teachers and adults who deal with children on a day-to-day basis, because unless children have those meaningful adults in their lives that they learn from when it comes to respect for relations, it's not really a curriculum, it's not really a module, it's not really a here, read this and answer the exam questions. It's just something that should be built in every single day. And I have enormous respect for our teachers, and the teachers I meet in the rural schools that I represent are very much members of the community and very much care about individual kids.
Okay, Vitaly wanted to jump in on this. I'll allow that to happen. We'll hear from the other politicians.
Yeah, I just think that this question is connected to the previous one, and I'm shocked to hear that in Australia it is unsafe to go home after midnight. From my personal experience, I lived a year in Japan, in Tokyo, and I lived 4 years in Singapore. In both of these big cities, it is absolutely safe to go on streets at any time. So I'm wondering, where is it coming from? Why? How are they different? And from my understanding, it's just different culture, different education from the school, from the families, up until they become grown-ups. And I think this is where you have to address these issues. If you want safety on streets, start it from schools.
Okay. It's interesting, isn't it, how sometimes an outsider observing what's going on in our country puts his finger on it straight away. Tony Burke.
I'm not sure. Look, there's a lot of people here who've been through the school system much more recently than me. But I'm not sure of the extent to which teachers aren't trained, and this is considered a key part of what's meant to be taught. Certainly in the early childhood area, anti-bias training is a massive part of the training of early childhood educators. How that goes through the primary years, I don't know. So I don't disagree with what's been said. I don't disagree. But I do think there's often a tendency when we find different problems to say the school's a place to put the extra layer of responsibility. I'm not sure of the extent to which a lot of that is being done at school, and it's the moment people leave school, everything else they see in society shows a complete lack of respect towards women in so many ways. And I wonder if on this one, I'm not doubting that there might be things that need to be done within the education system, but the weight of emphasis, I'd be surprised if it was schools that were actually behind the rest of society. I suspect it's the other way around.
Okay, sorry, there's a young lady up there who had a hand up before. Do you still want to ask a question? Because we'll get a mic to you. We can get the microphone to you pretty quickly. Where is it?
Right,
Bounce it over there.
It's going to be a long catch.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering what policies Splendour has in place to regulate their security guards, as I've seen security guards at the front gate saying they'll get people into Splendour if they are given a bribe. And I've also seen security guards here around the grounds actually dealing drugs. So.
Pretty big
Okay,
statement.
we don't have anyone from Splendour on the panel to ask that. I sort of feel I might have to take it as a comment, but I'll just throw it to Helen. Ever heard of that before? Security guards dealing drugs? That'd
I've
be
heard
shocking.
everything over
Yeah.
the years, and I think it comes down to the responsibility of, particularly in these mass events, it has to permeate from the top down. So it's important that it happens at the races, it happens at the football, it happens everywhere. We can't just blame the security system. It's about policy, proper training, proper briefing, and an ethos, beginning with respect. So respecting everyone that comes in the doors, and these are the things that we expect when you work within our organisation.
Mehreen, go ahead. And you can pick up on the other subjects.
Yes. Thanks, Tony. So I'll own up first that I am a woman in STEM. I'm a civil and structural engineer, and I did my civil engineering in Pakistan. And I did it especially, not necessarily for the love of civil engineering at that time, but especially because it was a heavily male-dominated profession in a very patriarchal society. And I did it because I actually wanted to say to people that women should be able to do anything that others are able to do. I think for me that was important at that time. It was, trying to bring down the patriarchy, by chipping away at it. So that was one of the things. And I completely agree with the transport issue. If you look across the world, one of the factors that actually really reduces violence is having good 24-hour public transport. And during those lockout laws, when that debate was happening, I actually decided to go to King's Cross, stayed there all night to look at what transport was available. And it was abysmal. It was people were, just standing around because there were no buses. I was talking to people and they were saying, well, we live way over there and it costs $150 for us to get in a cab. So that is absolutely vital. So I have been running a campaign for 24-hour public transport for a long time, and hopefully someone will listen soon. But just coming back to the education aspect, sexual assault, sexual violence is a cultural issue. And unless we address the root causes, it will not go away. It's great that, we put money into refugees and all that, and that's really important. But it's already too late by the time women and children are being bashed and have to look for refugees. So education in the school system is vital for respectful relationships. And one thing I'm very passionate about is consent, to look at consent in a completely different way. We know that we've had many cases, some recently, about how ambiguous consent is. We need to make sure that yes means yes.
Okay.
We need to get away from the no means no mentality. And if schools won't do it, who else will? Just one very quick point about teachers. And yes, they do require support. They do require support if a child comes up to them and reports violence. They do require support on that. They do require support on how to introduce a curriculum which talks about respectful relationships. So let's make sure that we make it priority. I've heard a bit of a talk about budgets, and we have a lot of money. We're giving billions of dollars in company tax cuts. We're giving billions of dollars in fossil fuel subsidies. I think we have to get our priorities right, and this is the priority.
Okay. Now, Vitaly wanted to jump in on the previous question, so I'll just let him keep your answer brief because we've got to get to Trump.
I think it was a very, very important issue to raise. And from my perspective, on my daily job, I have to think like a criminal to catch the criminals. I have to predict what would they do, where would they leave the trace to catch them. So I always put myself into the shoes of the criminal. In this case, if you saw something like you saw it, then if I was a criminal, I would actually put a uniform of a security guard to sell the drug. So I think if you see something like that, you definitely need to report such cases. It may be no case of this.
Okay, I'm going to move on because I promised we'd talk about Donald Trump at the beginning, and we haven't gotten around to that yet. We will. Nick Palmer has a question for us. Where's Nick? Yeah. Still here? There you go. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. So Trump's press conference and the subsequent retractions provide more Q than A. Was this performance just another example of his incompetence, or is there something more sinister developing in US and Russian relations?
Tony Burke, you've been watching this, no doubt, as we all have. Let's hear what your feeling is. It was the most bizarre week I can remember in international politics.
Okay, well, first of all, I have spent the last week in the Tasmanian wilderness with no phone reception, no TV, and it's been absolutely magnificent. So extent of knowledge base is not going to be that impressive on this. One thing that has happened, though, internationally since Donald Trump became the President of the United States is the normal rule on foreign affairs is that you try to keep everything predictable has just collapsed. And the sense of being able to predict what's happening, even to predict that more goodwill will be shown to allies rather than rogue enemies, it's the unpredictable nature of it. Yeah, I can understand why people get scared about the state of the world right now. As to exactly what happened during the week, there'll be experts who've at least seen it, whereas I can tell you some great stories about kookaburras, patamelons and wallabies over the last week.
That's a good cue for me to throw on to someone else, though. Sussan, have you been watching the Helsinki summit? Trump saying one thing at the press conference, getting on Air Force One, completely reversing it, and trying to explain that he said the opposite of what he actually said.
I could make lots of personal comments, Tony. I've actually spent the last week in the UAE and Afghanistan with our Australian soldiers, experiencing what life is like in the military and the work they do for our country.
I love the fact that you fellas don't take social media with you. I mean, yeah, no, that's good.
And pretty similar. But I pass on an interesting observation because I was talking to an American serviceman at an Air Force base in the UAE. And I said, look, tell me, does the American military, do you all support Trump? And he said, actually, we don't, which tells me a lot about how America thinks of their president. And as I said, I could make lots of personal observations, but my rule is that I tend not to make second-hand reflections. What does concern me is Trump's trade wars, because his approach to NATO puts the entire trade with Europe and the rest of the world under threat, which has flow-on implications for us. His withdrawal from the nuclear disarmament agreement with Europe and Iran is incredibly damaging to the future of the Middle East, and we should certainly worry about that.
And his threat, which you may not have caught up with while travelling, to impose tariffs on every single Chinese import into the United States. That's $500 billion plus. Economists are suggesting this could plunge us into a global recession.
And I'm sure it could. So let's hope that he's talking first and thinking later, and that his very exhausted advisors will be able to bring him round and put the show back on track. So we are a small exporting nation. We don't have the security of a domestic market the size of the US. So we absolutely rely on our trade with China, our trade with the US, our increasing trade with Europe, particularly post-Brexit. So look, it's anxious times, I'll be honest. And I understand that a poll was done recently about how many Australians support Trump, and it was somewhere below a third. So I think that's a good thing. We've probably worked it out.
Unfortunately, we have compulsory voting, but we don't get a vote over there. So, Mehreen, you've been watching it, no doubt. Or have you been somewhere in a rainforest?
I was in Albury yesterday, Sussan's hometown, but no, I've been around. And I think who knows with Trump what he's trying to do, what he's thinking, but I do know that the world has become a dangerous place since Donald Trump became the president of the US. We know in the US, CO2 emissions have been massively on the rise. We know in the US, since Trump became president, far-right groups have increased immensely. You know, that whole idea of racism and anti-immigration and all of that has increased in leaps and bounds. We also know that the rich in America, the big corporations, are getting richer. So, you know, very dangerous since Trump has become the US president. With foreign policy, foreign affairs, it's done on Twitter. That tells you a lot. And I'm actually concerned. I didn't see that poll, Sussan, but you said a little less than 1/3 of the people in Australia support Trump. I think that's very worrying. To me, that's really worrying. So I have the opposite view of you.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Vitaly because, as we know, what the dispute with Russia was about was Russian interference in the US election 2016. We're essentially talking about hacking into the servers of the US Democratic Party, then releasing embarrassing information during the campaign. That's the core thing that we're talking about here. The FBI has indicted 12 Russian agents or officials of the military intelligence, has said that they were working under the orders of Vladimir Putin. Your perspective. I know it's difficult for you to give any definitive answer, but what do you think about the FBI's basis for these indictments?
Thank you for the question, Tony. And first of all, I would like to draw some line here. In cybersecurity, there are now two camps. There are companies that are politicized. They attribute attacks to country XYZ openly, and there is a camp of scientists that provides facts. They never speculate, and they never try to go into politics. I am from the second camp, all right? The way we work, we provide facts that has to be in a form that is provable by others. Otherwise, it makes no sense to share this information. So I really hate speculations. What we know from our perspective is that FBI mentioned, they referred to a hacking group called Sophacy or Fancy Bear, that was the name attached to the group, that was involved into the DNC hacking. From our perspective as Kaspersky Lab, we don't have too many customers in the United States now, but in the government sector specifically, what we know is that we tracked this Sophacy group as well, because we are apoliticized. We track every actor from every country equally. So we have seen Russian-speaking actor known as Sophacy. What we also know is that in 2015, there was a backdoor for OS X, for macOS, that included a name and nickname of the developer of that malware that was attributed to Sophacy. That name was Kazakh. That's the name, the nickname of the guy. And occasionally, this name appeared in the official recent indictment against these 12 individuals. One of them was known as Kozachek, that's his last name, and he was also known as Kazakh, that's his nickname used. And it is the guy, one of 12, that actually brings this line back to our discovery and kind of suggesting that Sophacy group, also known as Fancy Bear, was involved if all those facts provided by the US were true from the beginning.
Tell me something. A lot of the hacking that we hear about comes from Russian sources, Russian hackers. Why do Russians hack in the first place? Why is this such a big deal in Russia and in the whole of the Eastern Bloc? Is it some special training you get at preschool? I mean, tell us about it.
Very good question. I'm actually from the generation that witnessed the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, where a lot of people lost their jobs, they get extremely low salaries. It was really hard for the engineers to find those jobs and to supply, to provide to their families. So there were a lot of smart people out there in ex-Soviet Union space that wanted to provide, but they couldn't. So they turned into criminals one by one. Many of those started learning computer science, and they realized that there are well-set countries out there in the West, and they started attacking. So it all started from the wave of carders from the ex-Soviet Union in the 90s, and then turned into other spheres, like they started distributed denial of service attacks, ransomware campaigns, botnets. That's all was originating from the Russian hacking arena. And the motivator was, of course, money, as usual for crimes.
And so what I'm trying to figure out is how it is that the intelligence services in Russia have access to these incredibly sophisticated hackers who can actually change the course of an American election, because that's essentially what they did. Are they finding criminals, threatening if they'll go to jail if they don't work for them? How does it actually work?
Well, here I can only just share what is believed to be happening, that some of those hackers, they make mistakes. So the government, the authorities may catch them, and then they offer these opportunities, two choices. They go to jail, or they go and work for the government. So that's a sad story, right? But this is how you can actually recruit and force somebody to work for you.
Okay. I'm not going to push you too far because I don't want to see you spend the next 20 years in a gulag. Well, I will, however, because we're running out of time, and I'll take one more question from the audience. So I'll take it right from the front. There's a young woman down here. We'll get a microphone to you. Ask whatever you want. It will be our last question, though, because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Hi, my name is...
Can you stand up for us? Thanks very much.
Hi, my name is Anissa. In regards to the occurrence of 9/11 and terrorist attacks through Europe, we've seen knee-jerk reactions by Australia in terms of hyper-legislation. We've seen over 80 pieces of legislation directed towards terrorism that erode our civil liberties, things like a right to a lawyer, innocent until proven guilty, accessing metadata. Police officers can come to our houses and search them without warrants. And on both sides of Parliament, we haven't really seen any politicians standing up for our civil liberties. And unlike America, where we don't have a Bill of Rights, should we all be scared of our civil liberties? Because there's no piece of legislation there to protect us once they're taken away.
Great final question. Thank you. Mehreen, I'll start with you. The Greens have been very vocal on this issue.
Absolutely. We should have a Bill of Civil Rights. But I think it goes much deeper than a Bill of Civil Rights as well. I think we are at a moment in time where we hear politicians making things worse by dog whistling, by demonizing people who may not look like mainstream Australia to them. And I think that's really problematic. I came to Australia in 1992, and I knew the history of Australia and the oppression and the snatching of land and the wars, frontier wars, and the killing that went on, and that discrimination still exists with Aboriginal people. But as an immigrant at that time, a person of color, I did feel a little bit welcome in society. But over the 26 years that I've been here, things have drastically changed. And those laws and the way our politicians have dealt with those issues have been part and parcel of how society has changed. To the extent now that I get literally hundreds of messages on social media every single week telling me to get out of Australia, to go back to where I came from, how I'm a putrid Paki who does not belong in Australian society. And it's not just me, it's so many other people who get those messages as well. And people often say to me, and these are often people who never have faced racism, or don't worry about it, Mehreen, they're just trolls. Don't give them any airtime. But, they're not just trolls. They are real people sitting behind keyboards writing those messages. And they also come through the phone. People actually call up my office to ask how many Anzac Day ceremonies I have attended in Australia. And I have received handwritten letters. And this is how it is affecting, apart from the civil liberties angle, this is how it is affecting real people on the ground in Australia. And that definitely needs to change. I just want to finish very quickly because...
You'll have to be quick, Mehreen.
Yeah, I will be very quick. I want to read a very quick tweet, if you give me 1 second. And it's from my niece who lives in America, whose name is also Anissa. And this is what she said on Twitter today. We're never going to make any progress if we keep framing every idea, every policy as right versus left, Republican versus Democrat, conservative versus liberal. Instead of powerful versus powerless, rich versus poor, enfranchised versus disenfranchised. The entrenched two-party system is destroying us.
Thank you.
She is her aunt's niece.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, another strong voice that's about to go into the Australian Senate. We'll look forward to seeing you on real Q&A programs. Helen, brief answers from our other panellists.
I'll be quick. I live in Melbourne. And Malcolm Turnbull's comments about the Sudanese gangs have been really hurtful, and this shouldn't be coming from our leaders. It's buying into an election that's coming up. So if Matthew Guy and the Liberals don't have good policy and they're trying to clutch at straws, that's why they're trying to ban plastic straws, because they'll have nothing to clutch to. So I work with the Sudanese artists that come through Bakehouse Studios. I live in high-density Fitzroy. I have family in Footscray. I have family in Frankston and Dandenong. It is a tiny percentage of our community, and it has to stop. This is the politics of muck, and our leaders need to just stop this right now.
Okay, Sussan Lee, do you want to defend? You want to defend the right of the Prime Minister to raise the
Well, on
Sudanese?
Mehreen's comments of the abuse that's directed at her, I condemn, obviously, without reservation, anyone who would say that, and I know that the colleagues of my parliamentary party would do likewise. To the young woman who asked the question, with great respect to your age, I would say there is a balance between the surveillance of the state and the civil rights of an individual. When I was not that much younger than you, I was almost booked on a plane that was hijacked in the Jordanian desert and subsequently blown up by the PLO. By the way, the Palestinians' cause is one I support, which is a bit unusual for a Liberal. I watched the Berlin Wall be torn down in 1988. I have watched eras of global terrorism that have frightened me and my family, and what we're seeing now is an era, in spite of ISIS, of unprecedented peace. But we should never forget that there is a rationale for the state to, in some respects, watch over us without being Big Brother. And if you want to know who's Big Brother, I actually think Facebook and Google are. If you own an Android phone, you switch it off, you take your SIM card out, they still track you wherever you go, and that information is available to third parties very easily.
Now, Sussan, do you want to pick up on the comments and the critique or the criticism of Malcolm Turnbull for raising the Sudanese issue in the way that he did in Melbourne?
I haven't heard those comments firsthand, but I am sure, well, I haven't, but I'm sure that they are balanced by equally positive remarks about the contribution of the Sudanese and other African migrants to this country.
Okay, Tony Burke.
Okay, I want to deal with, I know you want me to be very quick, but the two separate issues, one on the terror laws, the other on the debate that often accompanies them. On terror laws themselves, there is a threat. There is a threat, it's true. I remember one day when I was a new member of Parliament and new laws went under the Howard government, the first group of people, and they were supported by both sides of politics, the first group of people who were arrested were planning a serious bombing. They lived 2 blocks from my home, and it's real. We can't pretend it's the biggest crime issue in the nation. It's not, but it's real. And the extent to which you need different sort of powers to be able to get inside those sorts of operations, you do. And while we don't have a set Bill of Rights standing as a separate bill, every time the government has come forward with legislation of this nature, what has ended up going to the Parliament has been quite different because of the bipartisan work that gets done. So when people talk about why aren't there issues where we agree on them and work together, this is one of them. On the issue of the debate that accompanies them though, I absolutely hate the way it has become a go-to moment to try to change the news cycle, to pick an ethnicity or a faith, link it to something that someone has done, and then blow it out of all proportion. And I'll just give a simple example that is different to what's been going on in Victoria. 2 years ago, Peter Dutton, the Immigration Minister, was asked in the Parliament, because he referred to there being mistakes, and was asked, what mistakes are you referring to? And he said, under the Fraser government, and he referred to Lebanese Muslims, but he referred to second and third generation Lebanese Muslims. Now, we normally refer to second and third generation Australian, but apparently second and third generation still Lebanese. And the White Ribbon March, the biggest White Ribbon March that happens in Australia happens in Lakemba, 2 suburbs from where I am. A woman there said to me, she said, you know, when my dad came here, and it was just after these statements had been made, when my dad came to Australia, he thought, yeah, I'm copping it, but it'd be better for my daughter. And she said, my kids have been copping it all day at school after this has taken off in the media. And I'm actually starting to wonder at what point it gets better, because it's worse for them now than it was for my dad when he first arrived. Now, it will always be easy politics to pick out an ethnicity, but can I just say, it needs to end. It just needs to end.
Thank you very much. And so does this Q&A session need to end. So I'd like you to put your hands together for Mehreen, Faruqi, Vitaly, Kamluk, Sussan Lee, Tony Burke, and Helen Marcou. Thank you very much. And as you now all head off preparing for Kendrick Lamar, stay away from those drug-dealing security agents if they're out there. But can I just thank you all as an audience? You've been fantastic. Your questions were brilliant. If I could get you into a Q&A audience in Sydney or Brisbane or wherever we are, we'd welcome all of you. Thank you very much.